October 732 AD, the fields near T became the stage for what many call the battle that changed Europe forever. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, governor of Córdoba, brought the might of the Umayyad Caliphate, its cavalry hardened by campaigns from Damascus to Iberia. Opposing him stood Charles Martel, the hammer, leading the Frankish levies. Men forged by hardship and bound by faith to defend their homeland. One day, one field, one decision. Was Tours the true safeguard of Europe, the clash where Christendom's survival was secured? Or was it a smaller check, magnified by legend into destiny? What strategy turned Frankish infantry into a wall that blunted the thunder of cavalry? And why has this moment been remembered as the hinge of Europe's history? Welcome back, lovers of history, to Heroic History English, where the past breathes again. Today, we walk the battlefield of Tours to see why this fight is remembered not just as a victory, but as the moment Europe's story changed forever. By the early 8th century, the map of Western Europe and the Mediterranean had been redrawn by a century of seismic change. The Muslim conquest of Spain had been the decisive opening act. In 710, the death of the Visigothic king Watiza plunged Iberia into turmoil. Rival Gothic nobles split their loyalties, some backing Watiza's young sons, others supporting Roderick, the Duke of Batika. While Rodri marched north to face rebellious Basques, his enemies appealed across the straits to Musa ibn Nusay, the Umayyad, governor of the Maghreb. Musa responded by sending Tari ben Ziyad with a Berber host who landed at Gibraltar in the spring of 711. That summer at the Battle of Guadalix, Tariq crushed Rodri's army, towed the Visigothic capital, fell soon after with little resistance. Within a year, most of the peninsula lay open, and when Musa himself arrived with reinforcements in 712, the conquest was complete. Though both generals were recalled to Damascus, their successors entrenched Umayyad power in Al-Andalus and turned their gaze northward. By 719, Muslim armies had crossed the Pyrenees to seize Narbonne, establishing Berber settlements in Septoania. From this bridgehead, raids reached deep into Burgundy by 725 and by 731. Muslim columns may have struck even as far as Arles on the Rhone. Iberia was no longer a distant frontier. It had become the launchpad for campaigns that would bring the Umayyads into direct collision with the Franks. The Umayyad Caliphate, born from the rapid conquests of the 7th century, had carried Arab and Berber banners from the deserts of North Africa across the Strait of Gibraltar into the Iberian Peninsula, toppling the Visigothic kingdom and establishing Al-Andalus as a wealthy, energetic province of the Muslim world. That Atlantic flank of the Caliphate acted as both springboard and staging ground. From Córdoba and Seville, Muslim commanders launched foray and campaigns north of the Pyrenees into the rich counties of Septoania and Aquitaine, testing the fractured polities of Gaul and seeking plunder as well as possible territorial gain. The expansion of the Umayyads was part of a larger geopolitical pattern. Within a century after the Prophet Muhammad's death, Muslim armies had seized Syria, Egypt, North Africa, and Persia, creating an empire that stretched from the Indies to the Atlantic. Al-Andalus, the westernmost outpost, not only served as a frontier for further conquest, but also as a crucial zone of cultural and religious competition. Meanwhile, Western Christendom was still fragmented, its former Roman provinces governed by local warlords and kings who were often at odds with one another. The contrast was stark. On one side, a centralized caliphate with immense resources and battle-hardened cavalry. On the other, a patchwork of post-Roman polities struggling to define unity and legitimacy. For the Umayyads, striking deeper into Gaul also served a political function. Victory would not only enrich Al-Andalus, but also strengthen its ties to Damascus, proving the governor's loyalty and capability. For the Berber troops, many recently integrated into the Islamic world. Campaigns across the Pyrenees offered both booty and status. The army thus carried with it not just religious zeal, but also political calculations and tribal dynamics that shaped its cohesion. On the other side of the Pyrenees, the political map looked very different. The Merovingian king still wore crowns in the Frankish kingdoms, but real power had migrated to the office of the mayor of the palace. Charles Martel, the Hammer, exercised that authority through a careful mixture of patronage, military action, and political maneuver. His rule had been forged in a decade of internecine struggles and local revolts. He had fought to bind the Frankish nobles to a central leadership and to create an army capable of meeting external threats. Meanwhile, Aquitaine under Duke Odo Udo had its own traditions of autonomy. The Frankish world too was transforming. The weakening of the Merovingian dynasty opened the way for Charles Martel and his family, the Carolingians, to rise as de facto rulers. Their legitimacy depended not only on internal consolidation, but also on success against external enemies. Thus, the confrontation with the Umayyads was as much about Frankish state-building as it was about repelling an invasion. Victory would mean not only the defense of Christian lands, but also the political elevation of Charles as protector of Christendom and architect of a new order in Europe. The march to Tours did not erupt suddenly out of the Lire Valley. It was the culmination of years of grinding confrontation along the Pyrenean frontier. A decade earlier, in 721, Duke Odo of Aquitaine had stunned the Muslim advance at Toulouse, where surprise and stout defense brought him victory. Yet the respite proved temporary. Umayyad arms pressed northward again, consolidating Septoania with Narbonne as their capital, turning it into a secure bridgehead in Gaul. From there, raiding parties probed deep into Burgundy and Aquitaine, their horsemen riding with devastating speed. In 725, they reached as far as Autumn, leaving churches and villas of flame in their wake. Seeking to secure his southern border, Odo forged a controversial alliance with Uman ibn Nisa, Manusa to Frankish chroniclers, the Berber governor in the eastern Pyrenees. To seal the pact, he gave his daughter Lampade in marriage. And for a time, the Pyrenean passes were quiet, but when Manusa rebelled against Córdoba and was crushed by Abdul Rahman, Odo found himself exposed once more. Vengeance came swiftly. The Umayyad host surged into Aquitaine, striking at Bordeaux. Chroniclers speak of the slaughter by the Garonne. So immense, wrote Isidorus Pascensis, that God alone knows the number of the slain. Odo's army, reliant on infantry levies and lacking the heavy cavalry of his foes, was broken. Bordeaux was plundered, and the countryside ravaged without mercy. Driven north in desperation, Odo turned to the very rival he had long resisted, Charles Martel. Only by submitting Aquitaine more fully to Frankish authority could he secure aid. Charles answered, raising veterans from across Australia and Neustria. Avoiding the old Roman roads to mask his movements, he marched south to block the invaders. Meanwhile, the Umayyads, laden with the spoils of Aquitaine and emboldened by victory, pressed toward the shrine of Saint Martin at a prize of both spiritual resonance and immense wealth. By 732, the campaign had reached its decisive phase. The Umayyad force pushed through Aquitaine with a mix of fast cavalry movements and scorched earth-raiding, sacking towns and monasteries, and then turning toward the Lire Valley. Bordeaux and other centers were left in ruin, and the Christian levies of Odo lay defeated in the field. News of this devastation compelled Odo to seek Charles's help, and Charles moved swiftly to confront the invaders with a host raised from across his dominions. The two forces shadowed one another across the countryside until they met on ground between Tee and Pierce, a landscape of mixed open fields, hedged farmlands and woodland, territory that would play into the tactical choices of the defenders. The Battle of Tee, for that reason, is also called the Battle of Poitiers. However, my dear friends, keep in mind that this is not the same as the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. The two hosts that converged in the autumn of 732 could hardly have been more different in composition, command structure, and purpose. From the south rode the Umayyad army under Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, governor of Al-Andalus. Modern estimates suggest perhaps 20 to 30,000 men. What is more certain is the army's character. Cavalry heavy, mobile and accustomed to long distance raids, these horsemen, largely of Berber origin, supplemented by Arab commanders, were veterans of Iberian campaigns, adept at swift charges and at devastating towns with speed before levies could be raised against them. Some contingents carried lances and curved sabers, others composite bows. Together, they gave the Umayyad host a mobility the Franks could not match. Supporting them were lighter infantry and archers, but in far smaller numbers. The essence of the Umayyad force was the cavalry strike, a weapon that had cut through the Visigothic kingdom 2 generations earlier and swept across Aquitaine in the months before Tours. Abdul Rahman's leadership style was personal and direct. As Wali, governor of Al-Andalus, his authority combined civil and military power, and cohesion depended upon his ability to command loyalty across diverse tribal contingents. He had shown talent at balancing Arab commanders and Berber warriors in previous campaigns, but the strain of marching far from base deep into Gaul tested that cohesion. The baggage train was laden with loot from Aquitaine, rich spoils that may have distracted discipline, and some units were restless, eager to return south rather than risk a pitched battle on foreign soil. Opposite them stood Charles Martel and the host of the Franks. His army was less glamorous, but more rooted in the land it defended. Estimates suggest a comparable number to that of the Umayyads, perhaps 20,000 to 25,000, predominantly infantry. These were not professional standing soldiers, but levies of free Frankish peasants called to arms, reinforced by household retainers and some mounted nobles. Their equipment varied: axes, swords, long spears, and the large oval or round shields that could be locked together into a wall. What bound them together was Charles's organization. He had forged these disparate bands into a disciplined formation, drilled to hold ground rather than scatter panic before cavalry. Frankish cavalry existed, but in smaller numbers and less decisively than their opponents. Their true strength lay in massed infantry and the shield wall tactic, a hedge of spears and overlapping shields behind which men could absorb shock. Charles had also spent years consolidating his authority and rewarding warriors with benefices, creating a cadre of loyal fighters. The result was not a professional army in the Roman or Byzantine sense, but a political military community bound by oaths, land grants, and faith. Most importantly, their morale was high. They were defending home soil, their families, and the shrines of saints such as Martin of Tours. To the Umayyads, this was a campaign for plunder and glory. To the Franks, it was a fight for survival and identity. Thus, the battlefield was set to pit speed against solidity, cavalry shock against infantry cohesion, and the ambitions of a frontier governor against the hardening authority of a Frankish mayor of the palace. Both hosts, so different in nature, yet equal in determination, now marched toward the same stretch of ground between Tours and Pire, where their clash would decide not only the fate of Aquitaine, but the direction of Europe itself. The collision came in October 732 along the road that linked the valleys of the Lier and the Vienne. Although traditionally framed simply as between Tours and Pire, the exact battlefield remains debated among historians and local scholars. What is clear is that the encounter unfolded in a natural corridor of ridges, hedged farmland, and wooded slopes rather than open plains. Those features favored disciplined infantry and blunted the reach of mounted shock. Narrow lanes, tree lines, and uneven ground all reduced the of cavalry to reform and exploit breaches. The Umayyad host advanced northward from Aquitaine, having already ravaged Bordeaux and pushed deep into the Frankish heartland. Their march followed the river valleys that offered pasture for horses and access to towns ripe for plunder. Crossing the Vienne, they turned toward T with its famed shrine of St. Martin. Charles Martel advanced southward from the Lier, gathering levies as he marched and choosing his ground with care. Rather than risking battle on open plain where cavalry could envelop his forces, he selected a position amid wooded hills and broken terrain between T and Poitiers. There his infantry could form a dense block, shield to shield, their flanks protected by forest and rough ground, their front bristling with spears. Sources suggest he kept his cavalry in reserve, using them to counterattack only if the shield wall was breached. Abdul Rahman attempted to bring his mounted strength to bear. His cavalry launched repeated charges against the Frankish line, the thunder of hooves crashing into the static wall of shields. For hours, wave after wave pressed forward, but the infantry did not yield. The Franks absorbed the shock, their formation bending but not breaking, axes and spears striking at horses that reared against the hedge of shields. In contrast to Visigothic levies decades earlier, these Frankish infantry refused to scatter. Beyond repeated cavalry charges, the Umayyad army likely attempted multiple forms of shock, feigned retreats, detachments, pressing flanks and probing attacks to locate weak points. The Frankish response was not merely passive endurance. Skirmishes and small raiding parties appear in some accounts to have harassed the enemy camp and foraging bands, creating disorder at critical moments. The shield wall itself was not inert, but a disciplined system. Fighters rotated, fresh men replaced the weary, and Charles's officers kept cohesion under relentless impact. Contemporary accounts suggest that before the main clash, the two armies had skirmished for nearly a week. Charles refused to descend from the wooded high ground, forcing Abdul Rahman to either attack uphill through rough terrain or abandon his advance on Tours. This standoff heightened tension in both camps. The Franks, hardened by discipline and cold autumn winds, stood firm, while the Umayyads, dressed for Iberian climates, faced an early winter chill that sapped morale and stamina. Charles deliberately prolonged this waiting game, knowing that time favored his defensive preparations while undermining the invaders' cohesion and supplies. Accounts differ on the precise sequence, but a crucial disruption turned the tide. Some sources speak of Frankish raids against the Umayyad camp and baggage, others of confusion among the cavalry as they pursued plunder. What is consistently noted is the death of Abdul Rahman himself. In the midst of battle, attempting to rally his men, he was struck down. With their commander gone, the cohesion of the Muslim army dissolved. Squadrons broke off to protect the baggage or withdrew altogether. Without central direction, the cavalry's momentum evaporated. Sources diverge on the exact moment of Abdul Rahman's fall. Some place him at the front line, trying to rally faltering units, others near the baggage train amid a swirl of counter-raids. Either way, his death severed the fragile chain of command that bound Arab officers and Berber cavalry together. That sudden vacuum explains why discipline collapsed so rapidly and why squadrons peeled away to protect plunder or retreat southward rather than regroup. Charles pressed his advantage carefully. He did not pursue recklessly, but held his infantry line intact. By maintaining formation, he ensured that nightfall found his army still united while the Umayyads retreated in disorder. When dawn came, the invaders had already withdrawn southward, abandoning much of their loot and leaving the field to the Franks. Charles's restraint was deliberate. His levies, hardy but not professional, lacked the mobility to pursue mounted foes effectively. A reckless chase could have led his men into an ambush or overextension. By holding the line and consolidating victory, Charles preserved his force, won prestige, and maintained the strength needed for the political struggles that awaited him at home. The Mozarabic Chronicle describes the Franks as immovable, like a glacier, highlighting their discipline in the cold. It records that the Arabs fled by night after Abdul Rahman's death, leaving their camps standing to deceive the enemy. The continuations of Fredegar, a Frankish source, celebrated Charles as a warrior who scattered them like stubble, while later chroniclers like Bede framed the battle as divine punishment upon the Saris. Edward Gibbon and later historians argued that Charles had made the best of a bad situation. With no standing army and limited cavalry, he leveraged surprise, terrain, and hardened infantry to blunt the feared Umayyad horsemen. Strategic hindsight suggests the Umayyads' fatal mistakes were poor scouting, overconfidence in their cavalry, and the distraction of plunder. Flaws that Charles turned into opportunities. When the dust settled on the fields between Tours and Poitiers, the shape of Europe had been altered. Though few at the time could have grasped the long shadows cast by that October clash, Charles Martel did not destroy the Umayyad Caliphate's power in Iberia, nor did he march triumphantly into Spain. Yet the consequences of Tours resonated across political, military, and cultural frontiers in ways that transformed the balance of the Western world. For the Umayyads, the setback was severe, not because they lost an entire army, but because the momentum of expansion into Gaul was broken. The governor Abdul Rahman lay dead, and with him the fragile cohesion of an army composed of Arab commanders, Berber cavalry, and auxiliaries bound more by plunder than by permanent settlement. The survivors withdrew south across Aquitaine, burdened with loot, but stripped of their commander's authority. In the years that followed, Al-Andalus remained prosperous and powerful, but its attention shifted inward. Berber revolts in North Africa and Iberia demanded attention, while factions within Córdoba vied for influence. The dream of pushing the Caliphate's frontier deeper into Gaul faded, and the Pyrenees hardened into a more permanent frontier between Islamic Spain and the Frankish north. For Charles Martel, the victory at T was more than a battlefield success. It was political capital until 732. His authority as mayor of the palace rested on a mix of force and negotiation with powerful nobles, and he faced rivals both in Aquitaine and within Frankish realms. The triumph over Abdul Rahman gave him prestige that no Merovingian king could claim. Chroniclers, eager to celebrate his role, cast him as the champion of Christendom, the man whose infantry had turned back the horsemen of Islam. This aura of legitimacy allowed him to consolidate power, bind nobles more firmly to his cause, and lay the groundwork for his family's eventual transformation into royalty under his grandson Charlemagne. The battle also reshaped alliances. Duke Odo of Aquitaine, humbled by his defeat and dependent on Charles for salvation, was forced into closer submission to Frankish overlordship. Aquitaine's semi-independent stance eroded, bringing the southwest more firmly under the Carolinian orbit. For the Latin Church, the victory carried symbolic weight. St. Martin's shrine at Tours, spared from sack, became a rallying point for narratives of divine favor. In later centuries, Tours was remembered as not just a Frankish triumph, but a defense of Christendom itself. The psychological dimension cannot be overstated. For decades, the armies of Islam had seemed unstoppable, sweeping across empires from Persia to the Atlantic and even into the heart of Gaul. The shield wall at Tours shattered that aura of inevitability. In the Muslim world, the setback was seen as one campaign among many, overshadowed by greater struggles in Iberia and the Maghreb. But in Christian Europe, Tours became a beacon, proof that the advance could be stopped, that faith and discipline could resist cavalry charges and exotic banners. It was less the scale of the battle than its symbolism that endured, feeding into the self-image of the Franks as defenders of the West. Militarily, the clash underscored a lesson that would echo through medieval warfare. Disciplined infantry and favorable terrain could blunt even the most formidable cavalry. Charles's decision to choose ground carefully and to keep his men in tight formation transformed raw levies into an immovable bulwark. Future Frankish and Carolian armies would refine this practice, combining heavy infantry with growing numbers of mounted retainers. Still, the principle of resilience and discipline at Tours became part of the legend of Frankish arms. In the Christian imagination, Tours took on a cosmic dimension. Medieval chroniclers framed it as a confrontation between faiths, where the shrine of St. Martin was spared by divine intervention. Monks in scriptoria and bishops in their councils repeated the tale, weaving it into sermons and chronicles. By the High Middle Ages, Tours was hailed as the moment Europe was saved from Islam, a narrative that endured into the modern age, influencing Enlightenment historians such as Gibbon, who called it one of the decisive battles of the world. In reality, the Umayyads still controlled Iberia and maintained outposts in Septoania for decades, but the symbolic power of Tours outgrew its tactical details. It was remembered not just as a Frankish stand, but as Christendom's bulwark. And hey, this is only one chapter in a much bigger story. History is packed with epic clashes, wild twists, and turning points that you won't want to miss. So, if you like this ride through the battle that changed Europe forever, hit like, smash that subscribe button, and come along for the next adventure, because the past has plenty more surprises waiting for you.